It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Richard Holden, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Novara Media contributing editor Moya Lothian-McLean and editor of City AM Andy Sylvester. Today.
This is the first time that consumers have seen significant inflation for nearly 30-40 years. It's come as a very nasty surprise.
That's the boss of one major supermarket and prices are still rising.
I want people to be reassured that we have all the tools we need and the determination to reduce inflation and bring it back down.
Will a British Bill of Rights allow Rwanda flights to take off?
What our Bill of Rights will do is strengthen the quintessentially British tradition of freedom, particularly freedom of speech, but it will curb abuses of the system and inject a bit more common sense, if you like.
I think this government is just behaving like some sort of drunk at the end, you know, when the pubs are throwing out and they're in the car park and they're rolling around and they're going, fight me, fight me.
With strike disruption continuing, my guest Moya thinks more protests are a good thing.
The government could have made a move to settle this dispute, but instead they're escalating it.
We'll talk about Mick Lynch, the union boss, dividing opinion. And we'll bring you Prime Minister's questions live at noon. Let's start with the issue of inflation and rising prices. I'll show you this graph from the Office for National Statistics. The figures out today. It's a whopping 9.1%, up from 9% in April. And also the Bank of England estimates that it could rise as high as 11% by the end of the year. At the same time, the Telegraph has this headline, which is pensions to surge by 10% as workers told to accept a pay cut. This is the news that the government is going to go ahead and restore what's called the triple lock to state pensions. That means they will rise by whatever is highest, the level of inflation, average pay, or 2.5%, which is why that 10% figure is there, because obviously inflation is the highest. My question to start with is that justifiable, Richard Holden, when the government is also asking workers to urge pay restraint?
I think with pensioners, there's one particular issue, which is that particularly somebody, say, in their 80s, they can't go back into work, and they need that support. A lot of pensioners aren't very well off. We obviously had to see some restraint on that during the pandemic, but I think it's right that they now get that inflationary increase. I think the particular issues in inflation, we're seeing this across the globe, whether it's in the European Union, North America, all states are being affected by two factors. One is the world's coming out of COVID and there's a greater demand, therefore, for things like oil, gas, food. And then there's also that, which has caused a real spike recently, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, which is affecting everything across all sectors. We've seen a quadrupling of the gas price, doubling of the oil price, really hammering constituents like mine.
All right, well, let's come back to the original question, Stella, which is, Richard says that pensioners can't take on more work. But is it justifiable in your mind for the government to restore this triple lock, meaning they could get a 10% rise in state pensions?
Look, we know that pensioners are struggling, so we know that all people on benefits need support, and we need to look at things like universal credit and why it's just not keeping pace with the basic incomes that people have. I do think, though, it will stick in the craw of a lot of people that the government can find money when it's politically expedient like this, but is saying to people, and having people who are on very high incomes saying to people that you can't have a pay increase to cope with this. If you go to the shops every single week, prices are going up. I mean, it's noticeable, whether it is basic goods like a pint of milk or baby formula or even just a ready meal, and people are struggling. And so they're looking at this going, well, hang on a minute, how are you finding money for them rather than others? And yes, absolutely, things like the Ukraine crisis have caused problems, but there are specific issues in the UK economy that desperately need sorting out. And this is going to get worse, not better, which is why we need an emergency budget to go, look, inflation is so bad now, the risks are so great, we need to come together as a country and sort this out.
So
I don't see the government doing that.
Are you saying the triple lock shouldn't be restored for pensioners?
No, I'm saying that pensioners need help too.
Right, just to clarify, Moya, do you think it's justifiable when the government is calling on workers to exercise wage restraint?
I think that
every struggling demographic deserves support. I think that, yes, pensioners should have support. We know, as we've discussed, that a lot of pensioners are struggling. They have low incomes. They're not getting wages in. But it doesn't make any sense, apart from, as Stella said, that it's politically expedient for the government to support them and not be supporting the millions of other workers that they're telling in real time to take a wage freeze or pay cut when inflation is spiralling. So I think they should be supporting other demographics as well as pensioners rather than just courting their voter base.
Andy?
The government's in a bind here because, of course, no political party that seeks to win re-election after 12 years is going to tell pensioners to take another pay cut. It was exceptional circumstances last time. Clearly, it's going to continue, and the triple lot was put in place for that reason. The problem is you've got to pay for it. And we can talk about inflation, we can talk about cost of living, we can talk about all these things until the cows come home. But Britain's great problem is that on the one hand, we have a increasingly large state and increasingly expensive state, be it through welfare or anything else that we're doing, and we don't have huge amounts of economic growth. And those two don't go together. So until we start thinking more sort of holistically about where we want to be in 5-10 years and have a plan to actually pay for these things, then the government's going to have to make political choices, and that means, frankly, when there isn't enough cash, it is not necessarily a massive surprise that it's going towards people who tend to vote for the Conservatives.
Well, I guess it depends on where you look at these sort of like profits are going from this inflation. It's the big businesses, big companies like energy and gas companies that are seeing massive profits while workers are being told to take wage cuts. And we can talk about, the government making political choices, but the choices seem to always be impacting the people they're elected to represent rather than these big businesses who they're choosing to protect. Shell, BP made record profits. Tesco last year had a 2.5 billion profit up by 6% from 2021. These places where we're seeing the price increases are massively profiting, and it's going to their shareholders and the top executives. Meanwhile, working people are suffering.
Andy?
Well, all those companies having their margins eaten into, and there wasn't massive amounts of sympathy for these companies in 2020 when BP, Shell, etc. were losing billions of pounds in order to keep the lights on. But look, we can park big business, we can park all of that. On a political show, the question for the Conservative Party right now and for the Labour Party is, where's the growth coming from? How are we keeping the state at this size with an ageing population, with the economic growth that we've got?
We're going to move on, but I just want to mention also about benefits, because the usual state of affairs is that some benefits in this case would be uprated in September, which could be by as much as 10%, and that would be for April next year, as we understand it, but that will, of course, be confirmed later on. There have been calls for the government to bring forward that uprating, so that would be for next year. But certainly if inflation had come down by next year, that would be inflation busting for those recipients of certain benefits. Let's talk about the Bill of Rights announced by the government, the Justice Secretary Dominic Raab. The Guardian headline, number 10, to set out sweeping plans to override power of Europe's Human Rights Court. Proposal to replace Human Rights Act with Bill of Rights is effort to make government untouchable, says the critics. This is what the Daily Mail says. New Bill of Rights will curb bogus claims by immigrants. By contrast, Dominic Raab wants to stop repeat of Rwanda asylum flight farce with package of measures. Not that easy, actually, to say. Let's talk to our legal affairs correspondent, Dominic Cassiani. He's outside the High Court. What is this new Bill of Rights, Dominic?
Well, this new Bill of Rights from Dominic Raab is effectively a version 2, V2 of the Human Rights Act in some respects, but it falls way short of what some on the Conservative right have been expecting of Dominic Raab to actually deliver. In essence, what it does is it modifies our relationship with the Strasbourg Court, because at the moment we have a situation where if the court delivers a judgment, judges here, in essence, can theoretically adopt that, or they can choose to ignore it. Now, Dominic Raab says those rules are essentially not clear enough. He wants it to be clearer that judges should follow British law first, and then only European law second. And this bill is part of an attempt to do that. Now, one of the things it will also do is give ministers the power to ignore injunctions from the court. And why that's important is because a temporary injunction from the Strasbourg court stopped the Rwanda removals last week, effectively leading the Home Secretary to cancel the flight. In fact, we're here in court today to actually hear the next steps on that. But in essence, what the government wants to do is get this legislation in as quickly as possible to try to end what they see as a legal merry-go-round in relation to the Human Rights Act.
So if it had been in place, Dominic, what's your assessment as to whether that flight that didn't eventually take off, would it have gone?
It's very difficult to say at present, and the reason being is a slight quirk in what's now going on with Dominic Raab's proposals. Now, the Conservative right have wanted him to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. So he says we're not going to do that. So I think one of the reasons around that is actually that there is a consensus across the legal world that human rights safeguards are pretty important. And to be frank, if we left the Convention, we'd be in a club of two with Belarus, which isn't particularly a good look for a country which tries to promote the rule of law around the world. If this Bill of Rights was in theory, the injunction from Strasbourg could have been ignored by ministers. Having said that, it wouldn't have stopped individual claimants, people who are on that flight, going to Strasbourg, seeking that injunction, getting an injunction, and then coming back to the Court of Appeal here and saying, look, this is what Strasbourg's saying, and we're asking you, our British judges, to go along with Strasbourg. So it doesn't quite end that problem. British judges here could still take the Strasbourg judgment into account. So it's something of a moot point, but it is certainly, I think it's fair to say, tipped the balance slightly more in the favour of ministers and their hope of actually getting this flight off the ground. But there are a lot of unknown quantities in here. One of the reasons why so much about this is unknown is that an awful lot of MPs are saying that there hasn't been enough pre-legislative scrutiny of this really important, potentially, really significant constitutional change. And if you cast your mind back 20 years to when the Human Rights Act came in, there was an awful lot of scrutiny and debate in Parliament before that became law because of its constitutional significance.
Yes.
And 4 committee chairs have said we need that level of scrutiny rather than rushing this through just because of some kind of feeling there's a crisis over Rwandan flights.
Dominic Cassiani there. Thank you very much. Richard, for you personally, does this bill go far enough?
It sounds like exactly the right direction we should be heading in. I want to see the British courts being the ones who are the final arbiters. We'd had the UK government position backed up by 2 British courts before the European Court intervention last week. I think it's only right that our judges should be the ones in the end and our ministers who are the ones who are making these decisions. I want to see a firm but fair immigration system. I want to see people coming here on their merits, and I want to see the channel crossings stopped, because what we're seeing is human trafficking.
Well, so far, Richard, as you've seen, as we've all seen, they haven't been stopped, have they? And it's difficult to see exactly how this Bill of Rights would categorically actually help the asylum policy to Rwanda in the way that Dominic Cassiani has set out. Many of your colleagues would like to actually pull out of the European Convention of Human Rights in order to make it clearer. Would you support that?
I don't think that's necessary. I think that this is exactly the right place to go, because what I want to see is British law and British judges being the ones who are the final arbiters, not having it made by Strasbourg, and I think that's exactly the right way to go.
Moya?
It is British law. The European Court of Human Rights is based upon the Council of Europe. It was founded by Winston Churchill. The law that it takes into account was based on legal traditions from across Europe, particularly Britain. The Human Rights Act is based on that same law that was then enshrined in 1998. When the Human Rights Act was passed, it was referred to as bringing these rights home. The judges that sit in Strasbourg, and by the way, this framing is so xenophobic. We keep talking about Strasbourg, this court, this foreign idea that human rights are not intrinsic to Britain, that we were not intrinsic to founding this court.
But Richard isn't calling for pulling out of the European Convention of Human Rights.
He keeps talking about this idea of British judges, British law. Well, it is British law. It's entrenched. We founded it.
It's not actually enforced in the way that's being suggested here, because judges from any of those countries,
47 countries of which they're British judges
as well.
Yes, I know.
I am actually a member of the Council of Europe, so I'm fully aware of it.
And why not tell the truth about it?
I am. But these judges who sit there are not necessarily British judges. They can be from any country, and they're not named. And I want it to be decided in open British courts, and those decisions made here in the UK.
Do you disagree with Winston Churchill, who's the whole reason why they set this up, and I was a member of the Council of Europe as well, Richard, so I know the judges that you're talking about, was to protect British citizens from overbearing governments. What breaks my heart in all of this is the kind of libertarian wing of the Conservative Party seems to completely disappeared. The whole point about having the European Convention on Human Rights was to protect our citizens. And today, Parliament is voting on a statutory instrument to do with providing abortion in Northern Ireland. We would not have made that progress under this government because this government was ignoring the rights of women in Northern Ireland. It was using human rights legislation that forced the government into action. The same government that was also ignoring children because their parents were not married, and when their parent died, they were entitled to support through the state. So bereaved widows' parents. Again, it was a human rights ruling in the Strasbourg court that forced the government to recognise they had a human rights responsibility to those children. So the point here, Richard, is that governments of all colours sometimes need somebody else to stand up for the rights of their citizens. Why don't you believe that your constituents and my constituents deserve that protection from overbearing government?
I do, and that's what I wanted to be.
Let him respond.
Well, I want to be decided in British courts with British judges. I want here to be the decision maker, the final arbiter. I don't want it to be in Strasbourg. I don't want it to be with an unnamed judge from a country where we're not aware of. I want it to be decided.
You're not aware of the countries.
You know, we don't know the. Do you know the judges?
Yes, I mean the list of them.
Hang on. We don't know. But we don't. Hang on. We don't know. Let's just stick to the sort of core principles. There are two things I want to establish. First of all, Stella, were you pleased with the ruling in Strasbourg?
Well, am I pleased that fundamentally a policy... I mean, the point here is the policy isn't right. That's why the judges are intervening. Fine. So, yes, I think the rule of law should uphold, and I think British laws, which is what this is based on, should be applied.
Right, so why was it that the Labour Party couldn't then commit last week when that flight was grounded as a result of the ruling from the European Court? Why couldn't they commit to reversing the policy?
Well, I think Yvette Cooper did a pretty strong protest about the law and what was wrong with it.
That's different to saying that the Labour Party would commit. Why couldn't they commit to reversing it?
She was very clear that we didn't agree with sending people to Rwanda because we want a government, we want a Home Office that actually makes decisions. The only reason people are being sent to Rwanda is because the government can't fix the problems in the Home Office to actually make decisions about asylum. So we are going to deport torture victims, we're going to deport children to a foreign country with no support for them, and there's no clarity about what support is going to be overseen by human rights organisations because the government haven't figured that out, or because Priti Patel can't get her ducks in order to make the Home Office work. I think it's absolutely right that the judges intervened and said, hang on a minute, that isn't British.
Right. Is too much political capital being expended on this issue, Andy?
It's tremendously good fun having everybody yell at each other. But you do wonder, I mean, the timing... The problem with this policy is, to me, it sounds instinctively sensible. I don't know enough about...
But this is about the Rwanda asylum policy, but what about the court and the
Not the Rwanda policy. I think that was slightly bizarre. But anyway...
You are talking about the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, sure. We've got another row, right? We're in Channel 4 privatisation territory again, where we've got something that you can make a perfectly good argument for, but... Is it really the moment when the economy is falling apart? Frankly, the way to stop the boat crossing is probably to let the economy keep going the way it is for the next 3-4 years, because nobody will want to come anyway. But there is so much political capital being used by the Conservative Party in these quite contentious rows, and I don't necessarily think that that contributes to a feeling that the government is on top of the issues of the day. And we have these wedge issues that bring people from two sides into direct conflict, and without wishing to sound like sort of a slightly sentimental old type. Yeah, where's the cross-party consensus on this stuff? Where are we dealing with the bigger issues around the UK? The NHS is a wedge issue. We can't reform that because everybody starts yelling at each other. We can't necessarily have a discussion about this Bill of Rights without everybody yelling at each other. We need both sides to find a bit more consensus, or we're just going to leave these issues for another year, another government, and then in 10 years' time we're going to look back and say, well, probably should have fixed that.
Just to explain wedge issues here, because it's being used more and more, and I know, Moya, you'll want to respond to this. These are issues that are deliberately designed to be divisive and to sort of pit two sides against each other rather than pursuing policies on their merit and necessarily for the good of the country. Moya, do you agree with that this has become a whose side are you on issue?
I think the current government turn any issue into whose side are they on because the ideological push behind this, they don't care about who has to handle it in the future because they see themselves in power for the next X amount of years due to basically reconstructing the law in this country and the way that we go about democratic processes.
Is immigration a big issue, though, that should be tackled?
Immigration is an issue that we've been talking about for about 10 years. The Financial Times recently released a really interesting study which showed that British people no longer are as concerned with immigration, and that goes down in line with media no longer talking about it as much. So it's
because the government's doing something about it. That's why it's going down in concern, because they can see that this government is actually trying to tackle the issues of illegal migrant flows across the Channel.
Well, it went down in tandem with media, but I think the main point here, and going back to this, is that what the government are trying to do is rip up the Human Rights Act, frame it as if it's taking back control.
Well, they say they're not going to do that.
They say a lot of things, and then they do them anyway. They're going to rip up the Human Rights Act and frame it as if they're taking back control for the people, when really the power is centred in the hands of very few, again and again. Do people at home feel in control? After Brexit, after everything, do you feel in control right now? I don't.
Richard?
Well, I mean, you know, some people don't like when they're not in control, because the democratic will of the people has told them that they're not right. And that's what I'm in favour of. I'm in favour of the will of the British people being implemented.
How is this the will of the people?
Because we had a general election, and this is what people voted for. They voted to get control of our...
The Rwanda policy wasn't in your manifesto,
They voted to get control of our borders, to tackle illegal migration, and that's what the people wanted and supported. Look, and they also voted for Brexit, Stella.
What's Brexit got to do with Rwanda?
Well, we're coming to Brexit, so we don't need to do it here.
Jo, and Andy's challenge, can I answer Andy's challenge? Because I think it's a fair one. Actually, MPs across the House. So Jack Straw, of all people, used to say to me there were two divides in Parliament. There was left and right, and then those people who had to deal with the Home Office and those who didn't. I think for generations people have recognised that the Home Office is not fit for purpose. The question is, will these proposals make those problems worse, not better? And as somebody who deals with a lot of immigration casework, and also with refugees, because you don't know whether the people in those boats have a claim or not. And in fact, the vast majority do have a claim. All of us want good decision-making. I think we can agree. Can we agree with that, Richard? Can we agree? Can we agree we want good decision-making?
Let him respond,
Can we also agree that they're moving from a safe country, i.e. France or Belgium,
so you wouldn't have anybody. So are you saying that nobody should... Because both things can't be true, can they?
No, of course they can. We've taken over 70,000 through the Ukrainian scheme. We've taken through the Syrian scheme. We've taken through the Afghanistan scheme. That's what I want to see. Proper, managed.
All right. We're going to move on.
I don't think it's necessary to come from France or Belgium to the UK. That's all I want to.
And it's yet to be seen.
People dying in the back of lorries.
It is yet to be seen whether this Bill of Rights will do what it sets out to do, and I'm sure we'll discuss it further in the future. Let's return to the strikes, because the RMT union is holding fresh talks with rail bosses today after yesterday's strike action in a bid to come up with some sort of resolution. Let's have a look at this in the Times. They report, though, that Boris Johnson is ready for strike stalemate to last months. The paper reports that the Prime Minister believes he must win over the rail unions and is prepared for a lengthy standoff. What do you make of that, Andy?
I think Boris is probably right on this one. I think we are heading for a summer of discontent, as it's been phrased. You know, the unions have a inbuilt reason to, take action like this, right? Mick Lynch does not stand up at the RMT meetings every year and say, sorry, we didn't get you a pay rise, but I didn't fancy going on strike. They're sort of incentivised to cause a ruckus and to make a point. It's sort of in the RMT's history. What we've got, though, and again, I hate to bang on about the government, but we've got a situation where there's criticism coming from Cabinet, quite rightly, of the strikes, in my view, but there doesn't necessarily seem a willingness to bang some heads together and to bring the rail bosses together with the unions. Grant Shapps saying it's not for me to get involved.
I mean, surely that's not really credible.
But as a principle, it's quite a good thing that government is staying out of the internal pay mechanisms of private companies and their staff. We don't want them interfering every time. But rail companies aren't normal companies because of the way they're set up and the way they're franchised. Nor are we in normal times as we come out of a pandemic and heading into what is most likely going to be a recession. So at some point, there needs to be a little less sniping from the sidelines, worthy though that sniping may be, and a little more, as I say, banging heads together.
Richard, your response to that?
I think this is actually deliberately designed to be divisive, to use Moya's term, from the RMT. They decided to have a strike ballot before they'd even entered proper negotiations. I think there's a perfectly reasonable settlement to be achieved here, with some modernisation on one side and also some pay changes on the other.
So if there's a deal, a 4 or 5% increase in pay for rail staff, and it would call off the strikes, would you support it? Is Boris Johnson the one that is being divisive?
It's got to be decided, as Andy said, between the unions and Network Rail and the other train operating companies, because that's what needs to happen.
And would you accept 4 or 5% if the strikes are called off?
What I want to see is the modernisation, because without those modernisation and changes, the Office of Rail, I was a transport spat. With the Office of
Special
Road
Advisor.
and Rail and Regulation, come back every year and say there needs to be improvements on safety on the rail network. That's exactly what some of the modernisations that are being proposed here by Network Rail. That's what I want to see, and I think that has to come hand in glove with a proper negotiated
Did you join the picket line, Stella?
Oh, no, but I've been dealing with some very ill children. What I would say is...
Would you join the picket line if you could?
Look, what I would say about all of this is we can't talk about Mick Lynch if we don't talk about Grant Shapps, because you've just made a case that there's a deal to be done, and yet we've got a Transport Secretary sat there going, nothing to do with me, Gov. I look at the contrast between Grant Shapps' attitude, where he's spending all his time trying to provoke a fight and, oh, look, there's a by-election on Thursday, I wonder why that could be, with Mark Drakeford in Wales, who actually has been part of that process. I mean, Andy, I think the argument you're making made more sense 20 years ago when there wasn't as much state involvement in our railway system. Actually, now, it is in all of our interests to resolve this.
So, would you join the picket line? Because we asked your colleague yesterday, and Jenny Chapman said no.
No, well, I happen to think that industrial disputes should be about the industry.
Exactly, which is why the government shouldn't be getting involved.
Just shouting at people isn't going to resolve any of this. And Andy said it's a very...
You haven't answered my question.
But you're all talking at me.
No, you haven't answered my straight question. Yes or no? Would you join workers picketing?
I said no because it's an industrial dispute. But I recognise and I respect the right of people to strike and uphold their right to withdraw their labour when they're getting unfair terms. What I also see is a Transport Secretary who isn't doing his job. So Grant Shapps is on strike and then he's channeling Mick Lynch.
Stella can't have it both ways. It can't be an industrial dispute on one side and then be a political dispute, which the government needs to get involved in on the other. I think
it's quite... But Richard,
that's what they need. That's what
Richard, how do you justify the lack of action and intervention by the government when parts of the country have been brought to a standstill, and because of the way the railway network is set up, there is complete idea for the government to get involved?
Network Rail have been very clear. They want to have an open debate with the unions, but the unions voted for strike action before even entering negotiations. It's crazy. That's absolutely right. There is a deliberately designed political point here from the left-wing unions. The chap's a communist himself. The leader...
Well, hang on. He's not here before you say it. All right.
Pathetic. Come on, Richard. Are you going to help working? Because ultimately all of us want our constituents to go to work, and all this kind of bluster isn't going to help anybody. When you look at what Mark Drakeford achieved in Wales, do you not think, actually...
The Signal are on strike in Wales.
Given the
Signal are on strike in Wales as well.
I know you don't want to answer the questions because it's uncomfortable for you to face the truth, but fundamentally the government has a role in our railway system.
You don't seem to understand that the Signal are on strike in Wales.
Grant Shapps could play a role here.
Hang on,
Grant Shapps could play a role here, though, couldn't he? Grant Shapps could actually be an honest broker to help resolve it.
You can't have it as both an industrial and a political dispute.
Richard and Stella, since we've mentioned Mick Lynch himself, he's trending on Twitter, lucky him, social media. Moya, are your union barons back?
Union barons? No, I think collective action is back. I think we keep talking about Mick Lynch as an individual because the way that our media is set up is we focus on one person.
Nothing to do with Mick Lynch himself?
I mean, he's fantastic.
Right.
I think he's a wonderful speaker.
Do you not think he's promoting himself in exactly that way?
I think no. I think he's the union boss. Every single media programme has invited him on to speak for the union. But he's representing a big ballot. The union ballot's got, I think, over 80% of people voting for strike action. That's more than voted in, the general election as a percentage. That's a far bigger political mandate than any of our politicians have.
Is it healthy for this to become a personality contest between Mick Lynch and Boris Johnson?
No, it isn't. Of course it isn't. But to Richard's point, I mean, complaining that the unions are intransigent and not necessarily being entirely honest brokers. It's like complaining that England are bad at penalties. It's a thing. It happens. It's been happening for decades, and it isn't going to change overnight because of the way the union's set up and because leadership, as I said earlier, have a sort of vested interest in always being aggressive on the front foot, etc., etc. I have to say, Richard's points on modernisation agree entirely. I think you're exactly right. I just wish that you would sort of had someone from the RMT here and someone from the rail companies here, and you had them in a room together and were telling them both, and got them to sit down and actually you know, come to an agreement. The problem
happened.
is, but putting them in the room together at the moment clearly isn't happening. Look at the front of the FT; they're all arguing over the scale of a pay rise. So clearly, some sort of external force, aka the government, needs to come in and say to both sides, look, forget the personalities, forget everything. We need the railways to run. We need to modernise the railways. We also recognise there's a cost of living crisis. It really shouldn't be that difficult to come up with an agreement.
I mean, the thing is, we saw another clash of personalities, of course, famously in the 80s. The firebrand former leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, Arthur Scargill, up against the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher over a series of strikes. The trade unionist himself was seen on the picket line yesterday. You can see him there. What do you think about the sort of prospect of personality here taking on one another in this fight?
Well, it's not new. That's what you're proving with that. But does it broker the changes that our constituents need? Look, my constituents want to get to work because they desperately need to earn money because of the cost of living crisis, and they need a government that's on their side, not trying to score political points because there's a by-election coming up on Thursday. And whether they want to paint people as big meats, you know, Mick Lynch is doing his job as the leader of a union. As I say, I just wish Grant Shapps would do his.
All right, well, let's have a look at this headline. Moya, it's yours. Direct action is just what the doctor ordered. You've been saying so. Resistance isn't futile, and more people are realising it. What do you mean?
What I mean by that is in recent months and over the last, I would say, year, we're seeing an upswing in things like strikes, blockades, protesters stopping deportation flights, and this is a significant, in my view, increase in that form of direct action, which is a result of, I would say, a failing government and people having to go to the last resort. And I think it's important as an example of people power.
Do you support this, Stella, that sort of people power?
I recognise it, and actually I think one of the things that really troubles me right now is that people find the political process wanting, so they don't find that there's other ways of expressing their views. The statistic that should trouble us all on left and right is that 41% of people in this country think that democracy doesn't work. There's always going to be a role for protest. There must always be a place where people can have a voice. That's why it's important that we challenge a lot of things in the public order bill that's come.
But do you think it's a better way to go in the way that Moya is setting out?
I'm a Democrat as well as a socialist, and I want to see a democratic process where people's voices can be heard. But I am accepting responsibility that if people feel that politics is failing them, that's where they go. I think we should all be cautious about what the outcome of that is and what's happening where people are being told that democracy doesn't work, because I don't know whose interests are in, apart from those people who are already in power.
Can I just point out the article is talking about in times of political turmoil, when the democratic process, people don't feel like it's working for them, they go to people power. I think if the government was operating in the people's interests, then direct action would not be on the upsurge in the way that it is. I think it is demonstrative of a failed state. And I think it's important that people still have this recourse to express what they need.
So it's this type of government, not all governments, if they disagree with them.
It depends on the government. Any government can fail its people,
right,
whether left or right.
Andy?
Conservative Party won the last election. They have a mandate to govern as they see fit, as they kind of indicated in their manifesto. More power to the elbow of people who wish to protest. We have a very lengthy and worthwhile history of protest in this country, and it should continue. And that's, as Stella pointed out, there are some issues around that continuing. The question is, as I think Stella alluded to, is when does it go too far? When have you just told people too many times that the government isn't listening? Because at that point, then you start taking things into your own hands, and you start maybe to get a train going that you can't then stop. And I worry where it ends. Right. I mean, where does it end? I mean, in that sense,
I don't know where it ends. It ends when people get the things that they're asking for. I think that political disengagement in this country is terrible. I'm talking about this regularly in various other things I've written. I think that one of the biggest ills that face us is that political disengagement, that people no longer feel an affinity with the democratic process, that they don't feel like their voice matters, and that leads to paranoia, conspiracy, and a polarised society.
Well, let's just take one example then, Moya, because we can show you pictures of protesters in South London preventing an immigration van from leaving with a man who was arrested for immigration offences. He was later released on bail. Do you support that kind of action, Stella?
Look, I think the trouble with this, and I understand the frustration that people had, is that the government have now recommitted to deporting this gentleman. So there is a big question for all of us about whether actually direct action ultimately achieves what it wants to do. Where I think there is a problem, and it's where Andy's talking about, it broke my heart to see leaflets in my constituency being promoted by Extinction Rebellion, and hopefully, Richard, you and I could agree on this, whether we disagree about the climate crisis, and as somebody who wants to tackle the climate crisis, I feel very strongly about it, that said voting doesn't help. Because actually what that does is it takes people out of the democratic equation. I am one of those boring nerds who is obsessed with things like citizens' assemblies, democratic reform, democratic renewal, because I don't believe 650 people in a place that looks like Hogwarts gone wrong is the only way you can make decisions. You say, absolutely, the Conservatives run the election, but better policy making across the world comes from when you have participation of the public. So there's a two-pronged problem here. A, there is frustration and concern and anger, and there's a real worry about when it tips into harassment. And I think we've all got to be very careful. We've seen some protests recently where people have disagreed and it is harassment, and we should be clear about that. But also it means that the good ideas and the good debate and the good conversation you can have about things like climate crisis don't happen either. And in the middle of it, the status quo, the existing elites win.
Richard?
I think Stella and I probably agree broadly.
Hallelujah. There we go. We've shown it's possible.
Let's all go home.
That democracy is important. I think we also probably all broadly agree on the panel.
Well, I hope democracy is important. Yeah. I mean, anyway, let's just take that as a given.
I think we also... Well, that's not necessarily the case, because some
I've literally just said about... I've just talked at length about the democratic process and my investment in it. How dare you?
It was so close. We were so close.
I also agree on the right to protest, but I think Stella's absolutely right that it can tip towards harassment. And if you don't say where there's a boundary to that, and that's what Moya's not prepared to say, where she thinks the boundary is.
How do you know what I'm not prepared to say?
Because you genuinely said there was no... You didn't know where it would end. So I'm literally quoting you back at yourself. But the government... I think the government, has actually been... stepped up massively during the pandemic, stepped up to support...
Wait a minute, let him finish and then I'll come to Moya.
Because it was attacked as being not in the interest of the people. And I think this government is in the interest of the people. Stepped up hugely during the pandemic. Stepped up during the pandemic to support people across the country, stepped up with the vaccine programme, stepping up now with cutting the universal credit taper, putting £1,000 more in the pockets of people, stepping up...
All right, that's a great list. That's a great long list. We've got it all. Enough. Moya, I must just let Moya respond in terms of this case of you would have no boundaries. It could go as far as it likes.
Well, I didn't say that at all. You asked me where it ends. I don't know where it ends. I'm not in control of community organisation or
But is there a danger that it could tip into things like
harassment? I don't know.
Harassment?
What is the harassment here? We're talking about police harassing protesters. If you watch that video at the Peckham immigration raid, you watch police rush protesters and become violent with them, throwing them to the ground, pulling women's hair. That seems like harassment to me. But yet we're talking about protesters harassing people. Where does this harassment? Where does the harassment stop?
Well, let me come to Andy.
The rights movement on 1960s, was that harassment?
Andy,
you'll find no greater critic of the Met than I. So I watched that video with some scepticism, shall we say. But I can think of another group of people who felt like the democratic process wasn't working for them and felt like direct action was the only way to go. And they stormed the Capitol last year on January the 6th. And I just think we need to be really careful about saying that direct action is, something that we should applaud and we don't know where it's going to end. Because if you unleash forces, no matter how worthwhile the cause, that can end really badly if you unleash these forces.
It can end, but it can end fantastically.
But what about the storming of the Capitol? What about the storming of the Capitol? Was that too far for you?
It's got nothing to do with what I've written, and I'm not going to answer that question.
Why not? Because that was direct action by people then.
Because that's direct action used by far-right forces to...
You're going to have to hold that moment just for a moment, but I will come back to it.
But I don't think it has any relevance to what I'm talking about.
Just want to welcome viewers from the BBC News channel to Politics Live. We have, of course, got Prime Minister's questions coming up in 7 or 8 minutes' time. Let me introduce our guests. We've been discussing, a whole range of things. We'll come back to the issue we were just discussing, direct action. Conservative MP Richard Holden, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Novara Media contributing editor Moya Lothian-McLean and editor of City AM, Andy Sylvester. We were talking about direct action and how far it can go. The example that was being used by Andy was the storming of the Capitol in the US. Moya, you were saying that's not the sort of direct action that you would obviously not support, but it didn't go too far. What's the difference?
I didn't say it didn't go too far.
But it did go too far, sorry. What is the difference?
I think the difference is what I'm talking about in this article specifically is direct action, where you have, for example, a community of spontaneous individuals coming out in support of somebody who's being detained in an immigration van, taken away by police, bundled away from their neighbourhood. And what you're talking about is a group of people aligned with the far right who were storming with guns the capital. I just think they're completely different contexts. And I'm speaking about a British context, and I think it is unfair and also a very uncharitable framing of the debate to immediately go, but what about the capital? OK, but again, what I've said, what about the civil rights movement? What about the civil rights movement in Ireland? What about all these things that happened that led to great, amazing change, especially in the UK as well?
I mean, I grew up in Epsom, right, where in the 1910s, and I'm going to get the year wrong, Emily Davidson. I grew up in Epsom, and just more than a century ago, I'll get the date wrong. Emily Davidson threw herself in front of the King's horse as part of the suffragette movement. That was direct action, and I would, as we all look back on it, you'd say that was very worthwhile action. I'm not saying, and I think we need to get away from picking on certain incidents. I was just using the capital as an example. I know we did this earlier. Apologies to your news channel viewers who missed this, where we were arguing about the European Court of Human Rights and arguing about the Bill of Rights, and it became an argument about Rwanda. We need to get away, when we're thinking about principle, from these individual incidents and actually take a step back, think about the principles of these things. And just all I was saying was, it's dangerous to unleash these forces.
All right, I'm going to just interject for a moment, Moya. We'll come back to it in a few minutes, because we're going to pick up on this with Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor. One of the things we were also talking about is this thing called wedge issues, Chris. It's become a new part of the political jargon. Issues that are set up, as you know, but for the audience, to pit different sides against each other, purely on that basis, divisively so. Is that what's happening?
I think there is a bit of that playing out at the moment. I think there's no doubt about that, and there's certainly a conversation going on amongst senior Labour figures about the extent to which they get stuck in to those issues. And speaking privately to some Conservatives, they make the point, some of them, that it's fine to look at these so-called wedge issues if the issue is real, if it's actually a wedge rather than something that is, as some would see it, confected. So I think we're seeing an element of that playing out in our politics at the moment. I think in the past it's been something that Boris Johnson has been rather keen on in the context of Brexit. The interesting thing, of course, is that Brexit very much was a real issue that was a wedge, because it divided people spectacularly. The question, I suppose, in political strategy terms, for the two big political parties at Westminster, but for parties more broadly, is do these strategies work from the perspective of either party, and to what extent does, say, an opposition party at the moment get stuck into those issues or not? And that is a very live conversation privately within the parties at the moment.
Right, what about Prime Minister's questions then? Talking of two sides, what do you think will happen?
I think it will be, as far as Sir Keir Starmer and Labour are concerned, a conversation that will focus on the strikes. The strikes yesterday, the ones to come tomorrow, the ones to come on Saturday. Labour have faced their own questions, of course, as they so often do around strikes. The fundamental question being, which side are they on? And you saw Conservatives trying to, if you like, politically weaponise that yesterday. I think today Sir Keir Starmer will focus on strikes, and his argument will be, look, this is a government that's been in power for a long time, where ultimately Grant Shapps, as the Transport Secretary, when you look at the contracts that the rail companies have signed in this new post-franchise world after the pandemic, the backstop, if you like, is one of the Transport Secretary. I think you'll see Labour making the argument that the government should get stuck in. Their argument is ultimately the railways have to be financially sustainable, and that has to operate within the nature of the current contracts and the current mandate, if you like, that Network Rail and others have to negotiate with the union.
Chris Mason, you'll be joining us after Prime Minister's questions. See you soon. Let's talk about Brexit. We've mentioned it at various points in the programme. This headline in The Observer: Labour must break party silence on Brexit, says our guest Stella Creasy. Labour MP calls on the leadership to name problems as frustration grows with its stance on Europe. Have you had a reaction to your piece from the leadership?
Oh, well, you've seen that Labour is talking about Brexit. And today you've seen the research from the Resolution Foundation that shows the impact of Brexit on the cost of living. We started this programme, apologies to news channel viewers, talking about the cost of living and what was driving it. The evidence in the Resolution Foundation, independent think tank, the evidence from UK and Changing Europe is that Brexit has affected the cost of living in the UK.
But that's the Resolution Foundation. What's the leadership say?
So the leadership is looking at all of these issues. I am the chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. If I'm not the person championing the argument and saying we need to be talking about these issues, and before you read out another Conservative press release, let me be very clear.
This is your press release.
Let me be very
clear. But before you do,
could you let somebody finish
but before you do,
why do you attack me? Why do you attack me when I'm reading your own pieces?
Because I'm trying to say to you This is not about rejoining the European Union. It's not about the single market. It's about the pressures that our constituents are facing now.
But what people will want to know clearly from you, because of your position.
Because yesterday we held an event with the front bench.
You can, but hang on, just briefly. Are you advocating rejoining the single market and/or customs union?
No, because what I'm saying is we've got to do something now. So we need to talk about the problems now, about the fact it is hitting the cost of living, the fact that it is hitting businesses. A third of businesses have stopped exporting because of the paperwork. And we have to deal with those problems now. That's why yesterday I was pleased, and I was trying to finish your sentence, that the front bench spokesman on trade came and met with us as the Labour Movement.
But your solution is not to rejoin the single market. But do you agree then with Stella, Richard, that these problems do need to be discussed? The Resolution Foundation, every single official forecast says and continues to say what they've always said in the wake of the EU referendum, that the British economy, GDP, will be 4% smaller than it would have been if we'd stayed in the EU.
What I'd really like is the opposition to be supporting the government in trying to get proper negotiations with the EU. The government's tried to negotiate 38 times with the European Union over the current relationship. There are some people in the Labour Party who are more honest than Stella and say...
Well, are you saying that Stella's not telling the truth about what she feels?
Anna McMorrin said that she wants to be back in the customs union recently, Labour frontbencher.
Richard, I've just been completely honest, and you've just attacked my integrity rather than talking about the issue.
We saw during the last general election that Labour wanted a second referendum. I think that was a more honest position from a lot of Labour MPs.
Well,
Richard,
and that's where they want to go.
It's really disappointing for your constituents struggling with the cost of living, who need to understand how we can tackle the problems with paperwork, because kids can't eat red tape, Richard, and that's all you're giving them at this point in time. So, yeah, you can have a pop at me, you can have a pop at Anna, or we could actually get round the table and solve these issues.
Come back and support the UK government in those negotiations with the European Union.
So what's the UK government doing then to tackle that red tape? What's the UK government doing then? Give us an example.
That's what we want to do. Is it
signing a phytonutrition agenda?
What we want to do is sit down and negotiate with the European Union over a proper future relationship.
Why haven't you?
The European Union aren't wanting to.
All right, I'm going to leave you to just for a moment. We could go into the chamber just to see it's filling up in time for Prime Minister's questions. Let me bring in you two and interject just briefly on this. From the city's perspective, Andy, is the economy suffering as a result of Brexit?
Oh, that's a good question. Has the economy changed due to Brexit? Definitely. Particularly in the City of London. I think it's, in a way, forcing the City of London's companies to be probably a little more innovative and a little more fast-moving. It's been a sort of a moment for the city to start thinking about where it, again, wants to be in 10, 20 years' time. There are frustrations in the city that, for all the chatter about our future relationship with the European Union, we hear more about sausages and cod than we do about the part of the economy which, to be honest, pays most of the bills, which is financial services and professional services. So going forward over the next 2 years, I don't care whether it's the Labour Party or it's Tory backbenchers, more scrutiny of what we're doing with the freedoms that we've got around Brexit is a worthwhile enterprise.
I think we may have to go into the chamber. We might have a moment more. Moya, should Labour be talking about Brexit more?
Talked about Brexit so much, but yes, I think there's always room to talk more about Brexit because the implications it has had for this country are so far-reaching, and now we've taken back control, we need to know exactly what that means.
Prime Minister's question.
Today sees the unveiling of a national monument at Waterloo Station that acknowledges the Windrush generation's outstanding contribution to British society and will also be a permanent place of reflection. Mr. Speaker, as part of Armed Forces Week, I was delighted to host a reception yesterday in Downing Street. Members across the House are immensely proud of our armed forces, and we thank them and their families for their service to our country. And Mr. Speaker, I know the House will welcome the deal that we've signed with Moderna, which will see them build new facilities in the UK, including around £1 billion of new investment in research and development. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today, and I will be travelling thereafter to Chogum in Rwanda. I will then be attending the G7 Leaders Summit and the NATO Summit, Mr. Speaker, so a full budget of news for you there.
Chris Elmore. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's comments in relation to the armed forces and other comments? Prime Minister, has he ever considered the appointment of his current spouse to a government post or to any organisation in one of the royal households? Be honest, Prime Minister, yes or no?
Yes or no? Mr. Speaker, I know why the the party opposite wants to talk about non-existent jobs in the media, Mr. Speaker, because they don't want to talk about what's going on in the real world. I'm proud to say, actually, that we now have 620,000 people more in payroll employment than before the pandemic began, which would never have been possible if we listened to the right honourable gentleman opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is the global leader in social outcomes contracts. They can deliver public services in an array of areas from healthcare, mental health care, employment, education and development aid. According to Big Society Capital, every £1 the government has spent in this way has delivered £10 in a further economic, social and fiscal value, including £3 in direct savings to government. Does my right honourable friend agree that the time is right for the government to redouble its focus on these outcomes-led commissioning?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to champion this type of approach, which makes a real difference to people's lives, people suffering from mental health issues, helping them to find a route back into work. And that's why we are commissioning more initiatives through such funds as the Life Chances Fund, helping those people in society who face the biggest barriers to have happy and productive lives.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about Windrush? And can I pay tribute to everyone who is serving and has served in our armed forces? Can I also pay tribute to everyone standing for election tomorrow? In particular, the plucky Conservative candidate for Wakefield. He's standing even though his own colleagues think he's so useless they held a vote of no confidence in him. Does the Prime Minister hold any personal interest in seeing if the public will vote for a Tory that even his own side don't think is up to it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've absolutely no doubt that the people of this country and the people of Wakefield, people of Tiverton and Honiton would much rather vote for a solid Conservative government than for a Labour Party. They're enablers and acolytes in the Liberal Democrats, Mr. Speaker, the chameleons, the karma chameleons of British politics. When the leader of the Labour Party hasn't even got the gumption, Mr. Speaker, to speak out against the rail strikes to the people in the north of this country, up and down this country. Absolutely unbelievable silence from the leader of the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker.
But he's obviously not been to Wakefield recently. He's crashed the economy. He's put everybody's tax up. The last Tory sent up to Wakefield being convicted of a sexual assault. That's not much of a pitch, Prime Minister. Talking of people not up to the job, whilst the Transport Secretary spends his time working on his spreadsheet tracking the Prime Minister's unpopularity, thousands of families have had their holiday flights cancelled. It takes forever to renew your driving licence or passport, and now we've got the biggest rail strike in 30 years. If he is genuine,
Both sides, let's calm down, we've only just started. The problem is he'll go on forever and nobody wants that, I assure you. Whoever's speaking or asking questions, Keir Starmer.
If he's genuine about preventing strikes, will the Prime Minister tell this House how many meetings he or his Transport Secretary have had with rail workers this week to actually stop the strikes?
Mr. Speaker, this is the government that loves the railways, that invests in the railways. Not £96 billion we're putting into the integrated railway plan building. Not just, I'm proud to have built Crossrail, by the way, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to build Northern Powerhouse Rail. But what we've got to do is modernise our railways. And it is a disgrace when we are planning to make sure that you don't have ticket offices that sell fewer than one ticket every hour, Mr. Speaker, that he yesterday had 25 Labour MPs out on the picket line, defying instructions.
I want to hear the Prime Minister's answer, even if you don't. I think you ought to show some respect for the Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
Out on the 25 and the shadow deputy leader out on the picket line, Mr. Speaker, backing the strikers, Mr. Speaker, while we back the strivers.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised he's giving me advice about my team. If I do need advice, let's say about a £100,000 job at the Foreign Office, I will ask him for recommendation. And there you, Mr. Speaker, there you have it. The Prime Minister of this country and his Transport Secretary haven't attended a single meeting, held a conversation, or lifted a finger to stop these strikes. But I did note that on Monday they did find time to go to a lavish ball where the Prime Minister sold a meeting with himself for £120,000 to a donor. If there's money coming his way, he's there. He's nowhere to be seen. So rather than blame everyone else, why doesn't he do his job, get round the table and get the trains running?
Mr. Speaker, we are making sure that we do everything we can to prevent these strikes. As he knows, it is up to the railway companies to negotiate. That is their job. We've spent £16 billion looking after the railways, Mr. Speaker, throughout the pandemic. That's cost every household £600. And at the same time, we know why he takes the line he does. We know why he won't condemn the strikes. We know why even now he hasn't got the gumption to call out his MPs who are going out to support the pickets, Mr. Speaker. The reason his authority is on the line in this matter is that they take £10 million from the unions, Mr. Speaker. That's the fee that the learned gentleman opposite is receiving for the case he is failing to make.
He can't help himself. There's a huge problem facing the country, and all he's interested in doing is blaming everyone else. Can't he hear the country screaming at him, "Get on with your job"? Whilst he blames everyone and anyone, working people are paying the price. This week, his Treasury Minister said there's a society-wide responsibility for people to take a pay cut. At the same time, his Chief of Staff is trying to change the law to get bankers' bonuses increased. So come on, only one of them can be right. Is it his Treasury Minister who says every worker needs a pay cut? Or is it his Chief of Staff who says every banker needs a pay rise?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, under this government, 5 million public sector workers are getting a pay rise, Mr. Speaker. We've increased the living wage by £1,000. We've increased universal credit so that people get £1,000 more. Thanks to the fiscal firepower that we have, Mr. Speaker, we're putting £1,200 more into every one of the 8 million most vulnerable households in the country. That is what we can do because of the tough decisions that we have taken, Mr. Speaker. But meantime, what we're also trying to do is cut the costs of transport, which is a big part of people's weekly outgoings, by reforming our railways. That's what we're trying to do. But he's standing with the strikers, Mr. Speaker, and lifting the cost of transport for everybody. That's the reality.
His Chief of Staff says that removing the cap on bankers' bonuses is, in his words, reflective of our new approach. Pay rises for city bankers, pay cuts for district nurses. That's the new approach. Mr. Speaker, I didn't see that on any leaflets in Wakefield. But this hasn't come from nowhere, because according to the Financial Times, on the 7th of June last year, the Prime Minister was directly lobbied for the cap to be lifted. Rather than help working people, he's rolled over on bankers' bonuses, hasn't he?
Mr. Speaker, what what we're actually doing is putting, thanks to the decisions we've taken, we are putting more money into the pockets of people up and down the country, £1,200 more for the 8 million most vulnerable households. And the reason we can do that, Mr. Speaker, is because we took the tough decisions necessary to come out of the pandemic faster than any other European country. That's why we have unemployment at or near record lows, Mr. Speaker. None of that would have been possible if we had listened to him. And we have more people now in payroll employment than we had before the pandemic began. That is what the British people know, and that is what this government is going to continue to deliver.
Yes, 15 tax rises, high tax, low wages, low growth. That sums his government up. Working people paying more tax under this government, and now they're told to take a pay cut. He's having meetings about increasing bankers' bonuses, but he can't find time for a single meeting to end the strikes crippling the country. Mr. Speaker, it's Armed Forces Week. Under this Prime Minister, those serving our country are facing a real terms tax pay cut. Why is his government more focused on increasing bank...
Order. Mr McNeil, your voice isn't quiet. It's like mine, it curries. So the best thing to do, if you want it to curry, try standing on the terrace for a while. Here's
Mr. Speaker, it's Armed Forces Week. Under this Prime Minister, those serving our country are facing a real terms pay cut. Why is his government more focused on increasing bankers' pay than the pay of those that are running the country?
Mr. Speaker, how absolutely satirical that he should talk about our support for the armed forces when we've increased our funding for our armed forces by a record sum since the end of the Cold War, and when eight of the shadow front bench actually want to get rid of our nuclear deterrent, Mr. Speaker, including the shadow foreign secretary. We're helping people up. Yes, it's true. Maybe it's true. Mr. Speaker, we are helping people up and down the country. £1,200 will be coming into their bank accounts of the 8 million most vulnerable households. The cut in national insurance will be coming into their bank accounts as a result of the steps my right honourable friend is saying. But what we're also doing is reforming our systems so we cut costs for people up and down the country. Reforming our energy markets, building a nuclear reactor every year rather than one every 10 years, Mr. Speaker, getting people off welfare into work. 500,000 people off welfare into work because we cut the time people are waiting on benefits, Mr. Speaker, and cutting the costs of transport for working people, Mr. Speaker, by delivering reforms while they're out on the picket line, literally holding hands with Arthur Scargill, Mr. Speaker. That's them. It's worse than under Jeremy Corbyn. This is a government that is taking this country forward. They would take it back to the 1970s.
For years in Harrogate and Knaresborough, we had the Labour no-growth Northern Rail franchise. Yeah. We now have new rolling stock, more and better services. We have, though, seen some lost, as the industries had to suspend some services while they catch up on driver training lost during the pandemic. Strikes just takes us back to the 1970s. Yep. So will the Prime Minister's focus on the future ensure that we have apprenticeship schemes, focusing on engineering and driver training, to ensure that we recover the services lost and we have an industry that's focused upon efficiency and embraces technology for the future?
My right honourable friend knows exactly what he speaks, and we're doing just that. We're reforming driver training to make entry into the sector simpler, whilst continuing, of course, to make sure that we meet vital safety requirements.
We now come to Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Labour Party as we mark armed services? We can thank all our service personnel for the services that they give. Mr. Speaker, on Windrush Day, we celebrate all those who have made Scotland and the UK their home. My party backs calls for a major commemoration for the 75th anniversary next year, so we can properly mark the valued contribution that those that came here have made. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, this morning it was revealed that UK inflation is now at a 40-year high. Families right across these islands are seeing their income squeezed as prices rise, bills soar, and Tory cuts and tax hikes hammer home. After 12 years in government, the Tories have left the UK economy in the doldrums and pushed millions of people into poverty. So, can I ask the Prime Minister, does he think his government bears any blame for the fact that the United Kingdom is doing so much worse than our European neighbours?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, as I think the whole House knows and the whole country knows, we've got a global inflationary problem, but this government has the fiscal firepower to deal with it, Mr. Speaker, and that is, I think, of benefit to the whole of the United Kingdom, including Scotland, as we've seen throughout the pandemic. And I think it's a matter of fact that taxes are actually highest of all in Scotland, Mr. Speaker.
Ian Blackford. Well, actually, that is not true, Mr. Speaker. But of course, the Prime Minister can make all the excuses he likes. But the fact is, the UK economy is lagging behind on his watch. Actually, if he looks at France, inflation is less than 6% there. This morning's report from the Resolution Foundation and the London School of Economics is the latest in a string of devastating reports on the outlook for the UK economy. The report could not be clearer. The Tory government's disastrous Brexit is driving wages down, pushing inflation up, and will make us poorer over the next decade. But instead of reversing course, the Prime Minister is recklessly threatening a trade war at the worst possible time. Will he finally come to his senses and negotiate an economic agreement with the EU, or is he going to willfully push the UK into recession?
Mr. Speaker, nobody wants a trade war, nor is there any need for one. But I think I'm afraid he's underestimating what this country is currently achieving. Not just the Moderna investment, but a record venture capital investment in this country, which has now overtaken China, Mr. Speaker, as a venue for venture capital investment, and not to say nothing of what we're getting in tech. And that, of course, Mr. Speaker, the benefits of that are being felt throughout the whole of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much support the work of this government to level up all parts of the United Kingdom, including Scotland and my own constituency in the Scottish Borders. For the Scottish Borders, improved transport connectivity is the key to levelling up. So will the Prime Minister reconfirm his government's support for improvements to the cross-border A1 road and also the feasibility study to extend the Borders Railway to Hawick, Newcastleton and on to Carlisle?
I thank him for an excellent piece of lobbying, and I can tell him that we're looking, certainly the Department of Transport is working with Transport Scotland on the possible extension of the Borders Railway to Carlisle, and on the A1 a decision is to be made later this year.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's emerged that there is a backlog of 23,000 applications under the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Policy, with just 2 of 3,000 applications for refuge by Afghans who worked for Britain processed since April. Yet at the same time, staff working on the Arab scheme have been slashed by a quarter since December. This is an incredible betrayal of the Afghan people who put their lives on the line to work for our country. So, I still have casework, many people from the Chevening alumni, for example, who've been promised support since September. Can I send those cases to him? Will he put more resources into the scheme, and will he lift the cap on the ACRS scheme so that we can finally do our best for the people of Afghanistan?
I thank her very much, but I think I'm afraid that she is underestimating what this country is already doing for the people of Afghanistan. And I think on Armed Forces Day we should celebrate Pitting that brought 15,000 out. I'm of course very happy to look at the cases that she wants to raise, and we will do our best for them and for their families, Mr. Speaker. But this House should be in no doubt of the generous welcome that we continue to give to people from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, from Hong Kong. We have a record to be very proud of.
Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Chapelford, in Penketh, in Great Sankey and in Appleton all tell me they want to see more police officers tackling issues like antisocial behaviour, tackling issues like domestic abuse and burglary. And thanks to the initiatives of John Dwyer, the excellent Police and Crime Commissioner in Cheshire,
and sustained recruitment by the new Chief Constable, the hard work of our police officers is paying off, with almost a 50% increase in arrests for domestic abuse in Cheshire over the last 12 months compared to the last 12 months. Can my right honourable friend update the House on how many more officers have been recruited in both Cheshire and across the UK since he became the Prime Minister? And will he join me in recognising...
Mr. Prime Minister, can I just say, other members do want to get in. The longer the question, the less will get in. Your friendship will dwindle if you carry on like that. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell him very briefly, it's 13,576 more police officers, 200 more in Cheshire, Mr. Speaker. But what they're also doing, Mr. Speaker, is they're cutting neighbourhood crime already by 31%. Our streets are getting safer as a result.
Sorry.
Thank you. A clear majority of members of the Northern Ireland Assembly reject the government's protocol bill and the Prime Minister's rationale for it. And businesses fear its consequences. This Prime Minister has made clear on multiple occasions his commitment, so-called, to all aspects of the Good Friday Agreement.
Consensus.
That includes the European Convention on Human Rights being part of domestic law. So how can he stand over that commitment when the Justice Secretary is about to publish a bill that unpicks and disapplies the Human Rights Act within our domestic law? He can't have it both ways.
I think if the honourable gentleman will just wait for the Justice Secretary's statement, which follows shortly, I think he will find that he is in error in what he's just said.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. High-wage, high-skilled jobs is at the heart of my campaign to level up Rother Valley and tackle the cost of living crisis. I have personally hosted 2 job fairs, and thanks to £11 million investment for the government's Levelling Up Fund, Rother Valley will benefit from a cutting-edge skills and employment village and a leading incubator space for training apprenticeships and start-ups hosted at the old Maltby Grammar School, star areas were neglected under Labour. In light of this, will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, pledge his support for high-wage, high-skilled Rother Valley, level up our high streets and also visit Rother Valley to see levelling up in action?
Yes, I think probably the best member for Rother Valley that we've ever had, Mr. Speaker. I thank him very much, and we're going to continue with our agenda of levelling up across the whole country, through all the difficulties that this country has faced, and it will get young people across the country and in Rother Valley into good jobs for generations to come, and that is our ambition.
Osborne.
Speaker, tens of thousands of people were marching through London last weekend, protesting against this out-of-touch government. Rail workers are on strike, Royal Mail workers, NHS workers, teachers and even barristers are on the verge of taking industrial action. All workers are struggling to cope with the worst cost of living crisis in history. Ministers are planning to boost city bosses' pay whilst demanding wage restraint for everyone else. So can the Prime Minister tell me when is he going to stop meaningless sound bites and instead start supporting working people across our country?
If she wants to support the working people of this country, Mr. Speaker, can I suggest she gets off the picket line? And supports the and has a word with her leader, Mr. Speaker, and supports the travelling public of this country who want to see a reduction in their costs of transport, which this government is delivering.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For much of Britain, levelling up means the revitalisation of British industry and the jobs that goes with it. Many countries around the world, such as Germany and China, get a competitive advantage by burning lignite, the dirtiest form of fossil fuel. So does my right honourable friend share my concerns about the ethics of holding back British industry and exporting and magnifying our carbon emissions overseas, all in the name of net zero?
Mr. Speaker, I think we can all be proud of the way we've reduced CO2 emissions in this country, but plainly it makes no sense to be importing coal, particularly for metallurgical purposes, when we have our own domestic resources.
Louise Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows that we in Coventry and Warwickshire are proudly the UK's leading centre for battery vehicle innovation. He knows because he visited the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre just last year. If this government wants this vital sector to survive for the future, the Prime Minister needs to confirm his support. Will he give a concrete guarantee for the resources needed for the West Midlands Gigafactory project to go ahead, so we can deliver much-needed, skilled jobs in Coventry for 2025?
Well, Mrs. Speaker, that's probably the first sensible question from the opposition benches, and I can tell her, that we do actively support gigafactories because I believe they can be of huge advantage for the UK economy. That's why I'm proud to see one now in Blyth. We're working with the authorities in the West Midlands, in Coventry, to make sure that we also get a successful result there.
Sir Bill Wiggin.
Hereford Sixth Form College has over 600 students who rely on the trains to get them to their exams this week. What can my right honourable friend do to ensure that these young people doing their GCSEs and A-levels are not punished by the train strikers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know how much my right honourable friend cares for students in his constituency, and I can tell him that no exams have been cancelled as a result of the strikes so far. We expect schools and colleges to have contingency arrangements in place to manage disruption. If students arrive late, then schools should allow them to take the paper, and exam boards will determine if that paper can be marked based on how late the student is. And I'm told that, Mr. Speaker, if the student misses the exam completely, the school can apply for their grades to be calculated from the other assessments they have completed in that subject. And I hope that is helpful to my right honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware of the problems that arose in Paris at the European Cup final. Will he agree with me that both the French and UEFA authorities' attempts to blame Liverpool fans for the failure to keep order at the stadium has been comprehensively disproven? And will he ensure that the French failure to police the event is roundly condemned?
I thank him very much, Mr. Speaker, and I think the whole House will have seen how those initial accounts of what took place were completely debunked and proved to be incorrect in respect of the Liverpool fans, and I think it was right that the French authorities and I think UEFA issued a full apology for what took place.
Sir Desmond Swade.
Taking back control is to apply to the ECHR too, isn't it?
Mr. Speaker, I think he should wait for my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, who will be saying a little bit about that in just a moment. But I can tell him that when it comes to the Rwanda policy that we are pursuing, that policy, Mr. Speaker, has not been ruled unlawful by any UK court, nor so far by any international court, Mr. Speaker. And we will continue with that policy.
Lyra Wilson.
Much, Mr. Speaker. The father-in-law of my constituent, Ibrahim, is a former Supreme Court judge in Afghanistan. He successfully prosecuted and put behind bars hundreds of terrorists associated with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. 7 months on since he put in his Arab application, there is no progress. He's living in hiding. His only option is a perilous journey to Pakistan, where if his visa is refused, he will be deported back into the hands of the Taliban. So, will the Prime Minister meet with me and the former judge's family to see how we can save the life of a man who I have no doubt has helped save hundreds of British lives?
Well, can I thank her very much for raising that particular case, and it does sound extremely meritorious, and I'll make sure that she gets a meeting with the Department of Defence that runs ARAP, Mr. Speaker, and that we do our best to expedite that application as fast as we can.
To Ben Spassel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm proud to represent over 1,000 Park Home residents. When will the government address the injustice of pitch fees determined by RPI, and how is the government going to ensure they can all benefit from the energy grant?
I thank the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend. We are going to introduce legislation as soon as parliamentary time allows to change the inflationary index used in calculating the annual pitch fee to CPI. Mr. Speaker, and I'm told that the Department for Levelling Up and Housing has undertaken research on the impacts on residents and site owners of a change to the 10% commission that is currently paid on the sale of a park home.
Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister is as thrilled as I am that you, Mr. Speaker, signed the well-being of women menopause pledge last week to show support for women in this place. So will the Prime Minister follow Mr. Speaker's example and ensure with a better access to treatment for women in England by introducing the single annual payment for HRT now, not make them wait till April 23, a full 18 months after it was first promised?
I thank her very much for raising what is a very important issue, and one that is understood keenly on all sides of this House. And I know that my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, is accelerating the work of the HRT task force to give people up and down the country the reassurance and the treatment that they need.
Final question, Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was incredibly grateful that the Prime Minister launched my initiative to train 1,000 mental health first aiders in awareness in Watford over a year and a half ago, and it's been successfully delivered by Watford and West Herts Chamber of Commerce and many amazing volunteers. So I know he understands the importance of mental well-being and mental health. Sadly, bullying can have a long-lasting effect on mental health and well-being. So today, the Diana Award are raising awareness about bullying in schools and online, and with the Don't Face It Alone campaign. So will the Prime Minister please join me in encouraging any young person experiencing bullying to speak up and speak out?
Can I thank him very much and congratulate him on his own campaign on this issue. I think everybody understands that bullying is an absolutely appalling experience and something that we should not tolerate in our society. And I'm delighted to see so many colleagues, so many honourable members wearing their blue ribbons today, Mr. Speaker. We should all speak out against bullying, but we should also make sure that we give everybody the courage to speak out against bullying as well.
That ends PMQs.
That brings us to the end, as you just heard there from the Speaker, to this week's Prime Minister's questions. And we are expecting a statement from Dominic Raab, the Justice Secretary, on the Bill of Rights that we talked about earlier on in the programme. For this part of Politics Live, let me introduce our guests. We have Chris Philp for the Government, Culture Minister, Thangam Debonair, Shadow Leader of the House for the Labour Party, and the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, it was lively, noisy. It quite often is in PMQ. Some quite pointed remarks made all the way through. We'll chew over some of those issues. Is it because perhaps there are two by-elections coming along tomorrow?
Context is everything, isn't it, in politics? And yes, there are two by-elections which inevitably help shape the mood. And, you know, from party leaders and backbenchers' perspective, it's a chance to say something, isn't it, that they know is being televised. They know that we're covering it and others are, and that local media might pick up on too. I thought the other thing that struck me today, though, Jo, was the kind of smorgasbord, cornucopia of different topics that featured, not just in the exchanges between Keir Starmer and the Prime Minister, but more broadly, as you would more likely expect from the backbench contributions. I was glad that my prediction from the tip-off I'd had that Keir Starmer might talk about the rail strikes did feature, although not quite as prominently as I thought it might, wrapping it up as he did in various other issues too, not least this talk around a banker's bonus.
Yes. Now, this obviously was part of the sort of pointed questioning by Keir Starmer in terms of trying to frame the debate. I'll let others decide successfully or not, in terms of Boris Johnson being on the wrong side when it came to issues like strikes and cost of living, and being on the side of bankers because the government, he said, had taken away the cap on bankers' bonuses, that it has been lifted. Is that true?
It's quite a lot more complicated than that. So the backstory to this is that The Independent reported that there was an idea floated, this letter that had been sent, they reported, from Steve Barclay, the Chief of Staff in Number 10, to the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, about getting rid of this bankers' bonus cap, which was something that came in after the financial crisis. It was an EU-wide thing, limiting a bonus ceiling to 100% of fixed pay or 200% if it was approved by shareholders. Speaking to people in the last 20 minutes in the Treasury and elsewhere whilst those exchanges were going on, it is more complicated than that. The Treasury say they didn't recognise where that had come from. I haven't quite got to the bottom as to whether or not that letter was actually sent. Just to bring you a sense of something I was told in the last few minutes, if I log onto my phone, people in the Treasury saying they are puzzled by it. It would appear there has been some discussion going on at the Department of Business about changing the regulation as far as non-executive directors are concerned and their payment to try and ensure that they are better bought into and invested in the success of the company that they are involved in running. So it seems a little more complicated than some of the headlines connected to it, but nonetheless one where Keir Starmer felt that he could make some political gain or capital out of drawing a contrast between that idea, even if it is more narrow than some of the headlines suggest, and the broader concerns of so many more on the whole cost of living question.
All right, well, I mean, Thangan, just picking up on that, because it is, as Chris said, it's not about how much executives are paid. This is what the Treasury have said. We are not looking at a banker's bonus cap or lifting it. It is a specific issue around non-executive directors' shares, how they are paid, not what they are paid. Would you agree it's not as clear-cut as Keir Starmer set out in terms of lifting a cap on bankers' bonuses, executives in banks?
I didn't notice the Prime Minister deny it, which I thought was notable. And Chris has clearly maybe got his head around more of the detail than the Prime Minister has as what's actually going on at the Treasury. I think there is a contrast, though. And the fact that the Prime Minister didn't deny it tells its own story, because what we are also not seeing is a Prime Minister that's on top of actually governing the country and dealing with the cost of living crisis, which is affecting everybody up and down the country.
I mean, would you actually say it's a priority at all?
Well, the priority for the government is helping people on lower incomes. That's why just a few weeks ago, the national living wage, which is paid to people on the lowest incomes, went up by 6 or 7% to £9.50 an hour. It's gone up from £5.93 under the last Labour government. It's why in the next few weeks...
Which 12 years ago.
It's why it's gone up by 6-7% just recently. It's why the people on lowest incomes are getting £1,200 paid directly to them to help them in the cost of living crisis. So our priority is helping people on the lowest incomes. On this debate about the bankers' bonuses, clearly there's some detailed discussion going on in government. I'm not privy to that.
But would you agree it shouldn't be a priority?
Our priority are people on low incomes.
Right,
but on this debate about bonus caps, I think one needs to be a little bit thoughtful. It's very easy as a political headline, as Keir Starmer tried to say, we leave the bankers' cap in place. But if that means there are high-paid people who, instead of coming to the UK, go and work in America or Singapore or Hong Kong,
you're saying it is true then, possibly, that the cap is being...
Let me finish the point. I don't know because I'm not party to it. I'm just saying often there is more to these matters than meets the eye. And if people who are going to pay a lot of tax in this country that would fund nurses and doctors and teachers instead go and work in Singapore or Hong Kong, that isn't necessarily a good thing. So these things do require a little bit more thought and care than an off-the-cuff headline remark.
But the thoughtlessness is when Chief Secretary of the Treasury is telling working people that they shouldn't be asking for a pay rise. That's the thoughtlessness, and that's where the contrast comes from, is people telling working people, you neither deserve nor are you going to get a pay rise. And you saying right here, actually, that maybe it's all right for the rich to have a bonus. That is the contrast that people will draw. That is the contrast people will draw. And when people are still struggling with their bills, that's what they're going to get.
I'm just saying it needs to be looked at carefully and thoughtfully, not in a headline grabby way. But this government's priority, to say again, are people on low incomes, hence the massive increase in the national living wage,
and hence the support that
we're giving.
Let's just park that particular point around the bankers' bonuses until we really do get to the very bottom of it for perhaps tomorrow. Let me just show you the graph we used at the very top of the programme, the UK inflation rate. That will be at the front of everyone's minds. 9.1%, a whopping 9.1%. It is at a 40-year high. The question everyone will want to know from both of you is what can be done about it? Chris, you first of all, because Rishi Sunak has today said we've got all the tools at our disposal to bring down inflation. Really?
So these figures clearly are, first of all, a global phenomenon. The OECD average inflation figure most recently was 8.8%. So we're almost exactly on that global average. So the question is, what's causing it? It's things like Russia-Ukraine, it's the Chinese COVID issues, it's post-COVID supply chain issues, it's people coming out of the workforce after COVID.
So if it's global, if they're global pressures, what can you do about it?
Good question. So the first thing we can do, the most immediate thing we can do, is make sure people, especially on lower incomes, are protected as far as possible. Hence, let me tell you what we're doing. The increase in the minimum wage, I mentioned a minute ago, a 6-7% increase. We're cutting taxes like the fuel duty. We're putting £1,200 into the pockets of people on lower incomes through things like the £150 council tax rebate, the £400 for fuel.
Chris, I want to stop you making a long list. I know those things
It is a long list because we're doing a lot to help.
They are, except when the rate of inflation is at 9.1%. It is de minimis. I mean, it's diminished in the minds and the pockets of most of the people that you are talking about. You would accept that?
Well, it's not. I don't think £1,200 in the next few months is a de minimis or small amount. I would not. By the way, it adds up to £37 billion this year. So it is a huge contribution targeted at people on lower income. So
although that includes tax cuts, not tax rises. That's what the IFS have said. I mean, I'll just read you, actually, what Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies said. It's disappointing, he said, to hear the Chancellor again conclude by claiming to be cutting taxes. He emphatically is not. He is raising them, and to historically high levels. I think that is the right thing to do, but his tax plan is to raise taxes, not, as he keeps saying, to cut them.
Well, I think we need to just differentiate between the short-term measures and the long-term. In the short term, we do have to fund public services. That £37 billion I just mentioned does need to be paid for. The record numbers of doctors and nurses do need to be paid for. The extra 20,000 police need to be paid for. And we need to be responsible about that. But taking a medium-term view, the Chancellor's been clear. He does want to get tax down. That's why he's pre-announced the reduction in income tax. And in the medium term, clearly cutting taxes will stimulate growth and help with cost of living issues, but we have to do it responsibly because money doesn't grow on trees.
Right. Would you agree, Thangham, that overall the government's cost of living measures, as listed in part or almost in total by Chris, there are progressive? More money is going to poorer people than to relatively richer people. That was something Paul Johnson from the IFS also said. He said Rishi Sunak's big announcement last month on cost of living payments is strikingly progressive.
And yet, people up and down the country are struggling.
Well, that may be true, but is it going to the right people?
And yet, people on low incomes, who Chris has mentioned, are the ones who are struggling most. That's why they need the most help. And I'm afraid, Chris, that with 15 Tory tax rises in 2 years, it's really difficult to hear you say that the Chancellor's all about cutting taxes. But none of that's helping pay the bills now. So people who are struggling now are still struggling. They're still telling people like me, and up and down the country I'm talking to people who are telling me of struggles that they're having. Now, that's how it feels. And when you add on top of that the other options that you have got, when you've got stagnating growth, you've got tax rises, and you've got inflation at 9.1%, just saying, well, other countries are having it hard too, really doesn't cut it, because I'm afraid it just shows that you are in a government that is failing to govern. And that's how it looks, and that's how it feels.
Let's be clear. This £1,200, right, it's landing in these few months. It's not in the future. It's not in 10 years' time.
People are struggling now,
I understand, but it's this year. That's why we're acting now. We're acting today.
And yet people
it's
are
hitting people's
now.
bank accounts this month, next month, and into the autumn. The action is now.
Chris, I'm just going to bring Chris in.
It's the defining political issue, isn't it, between now and the next general election? There's lots of noise about other issues, and that they will occasionally grab headlines. But wrestling with this huge economic conundrum of what you do with prices spiralling to a greater extent than they have in many people's lifetimes, where some of the tools that any government can deploy are quite blunt, and there's also a fear from some in government that you deploy the wrong ones at the wrong time, or even the right ones at the wrong time, and you make the situation worse because you contribute towards inflation getting worse. And that when you make big interventions that are costly by any modern metric, there can still be plenty of people who will say, we are still really struggling. And you've seen that conversation playing out in the conversation just now.
Well, when you talk about things that might contribute to inflation, or in terms of the groups of people who will receive, as Chris is saying and Thangham is saying, it's not going to be enough, what about pensions? Again, we talked about this at the beginning, because the triple lock, as called, is going to be reinstated, as the government said. But is this the right time to reinstate devastated because it could mean that pensions go up by 10% if the Bank of England is right and inflation continues to rise to 11% by the end of the year. 10% is an awful lot more than any of the pay increases that we are talking about.
Yeah, and so you'll have a conversation that's already beginning around sort of generational equality. Now, we should spell out that what came yesterday was confirmation of what the government had already said, which is that it had said it was temporarily suspending the triple lock and that it would return, and that was then confirmed. As you say, when you map ahead to where inflation is likely to be, and therefore the number that is used for that uprating come next year, it could be very significant. And there will be plenty, of course, who will draw a contrast between that and where wages for most people are.
Right. In terms of what Labour would do, because you've set out a critique of what the government is, or in your case, not doing, in your view, what would Labour do at this point?
Well, I can give you some examples of what would be in an emergency budget, and that's the first thing that we would be doing. This is an emergency, and Rachel Reeves would be setting out in an emergency budget things such as cutting VAT, which this government said was going to be one of their Brexit bonuses. We see no signs of the cut to VAT on energy bills, which would help more people right now.
Although not as progressive as some of the other measures.
They could, but it still could be something that they did originally say they were going to do, and they have failed to do. They could be setting out a plan of investment in the renewable energies that we're going to need well into the future.
Short term, because you wanted to help people right now.
We need to do both. Well, I was trying to give you a short-term and a long-term example.
Fair enough.
And I think that that's because we need both short, medium and long-term measures.
What other short-term measures would there be? Because it is true that next month people will be taken out, or some people will be taken out of paying national insurance contributions. And it is true, of course, other people will be paying, or have been paying, more. And some of the rebates in terms of energy bills, £400, I think it is for every family, will be coming. That isn't agreeably till the autumn. What other short-term measure would Labour do?
Some of those things could have been done months ago and should have been done months ago.
We're in your emergency budget. There's Rachel Reeves. She's cutting VAT.
November.
She wants more investment in renewables. What else would she say?
First of all, we'd have done it by now. We started calling for it in November, I believe, last year. And we were calling for months for the windfall tax. And even the day before the government U-turned on that, the Prime Minister rubbished it in PMQs. Now, if that had been put in place months ago, then that would have been families who have been struggling, really struggling, and are still struggling to cope with and to manage how they're going to get through the next few months. Those are all things which could have been done months ago and should have been done months ago. Even now they could cut VAT, and they should do.
Right. If there was an emergency budget, first of all, do you think there should be? Do you think Rishi Sunak should come back before the autumn?
No, I think the measures I set out already, and I won't list them again, don't worry.
Thanks.
I think are a really very, very strong and impactful set of measures. And as you say, they are.
We don't know yet, do we?
Well, it's £37 billion, and they are, as you say, taking effect in the coming weeks. A VAT cut puts lots of money back into the pockets of people who are better off. We're trying to target the help to those on lower incomes.
It would help them down in
and in terms of the windfall tax, the windfall tax that we came up with was about 2.5 times bigger than the Labour one.
All right, but Labour have been calling for that, to be fair. I know they may be different.
Thank you for showing that we're fiscally careful.
Can I come back to the more interesting question, which Chris was posing? Sort of how do we get through this inflationary problem, which is a more sort of philosophical and thoughtful issue. So besides these short-term measures, what do we do? Some people say, well, do you just give everyone a 10% pay rise? I mean, that, I think, would be clearly ludicrous, because it would simply immediately feed into another step upwards in inflation. So you can't simply dish out across-the-board pay rises to fix this. So how do you fix it? Clearly, the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee have a bunch of monetary levers, particularly interest rates and quantitative easing.
Well,
where
and
there is
they've
still a
gone up, the
gigantic stock. They've gone up. There's still a gigantic stock of quantitative easing outstanding. But beyond that, let's look to the longer term. The only way, I think, to really fix inflation over a period of 1, 2, 3, 4 years is to make the economy inherently more productive. So the area that I'm responsible for
you've had 12 years of really low productivity.
Is technology.
12 years at this.
And it's interesting the Prime Minister mentioned some figures I gave him, actually, that our investment in our tech sector this year so far, first 5 months, is higher than any country in the world apart from the United States. And that is investing in technologies for the future to make our economy more productive. And in the context of this rail dispute,
we'll come on to that in a minute.
It's all about productivity, because we can't either reduce ticket prices or increase wages for workers, or both, unless that's underpinned by
Of course,
real productivity
and
gains.
I know that Network Rail want
serious...
to tie in the modernisation with any further
this
pay
is the sort of serious, mature debate we need to be having.
All right, well, let's continue being serious and mature, unlike on Politics Live usually. On that philosophical debate in terms of can governments do everything for people? And can they give 10% pay rises to everybody who wants them? Is that what Labour would agree to? Or do you agree with Chris, it would lead to an inflationary spiral?
So we have independent pay review bodies for a reason.
Oh, so you don't mind the government's not been involved then
But I think that the pay, when the government is, I mean, in terms of the rail strikes, I mean, for a start, Network Rail is a nationalised company, so the government is should not just be at the table, it pretty much is the table.
But on the question of 10% pay rises across the board for the public sector.
Well, at the moment, we are waiting for various pay review bodies to come up with their recommendations. And I think it's important that we're clear that when we have a government that's presiding over low growth, low productivity, high inflation, and has been doing so for some time. This predates Ukraine, it predates COVID. I'm afraid to say you've had 12 years to sort out productivity. Productivity has been flatlining for some
Growth last year was 7.5%.
Oh, come on. You're going to compare what was in the COVID year with last year. That's ridiculous. You've had 12 years to sort out productivity, and we're nowhere. We're absolutely nowhere.
Let's talk about rail strikes, Chris. Obviously, that is ongoing. Now, the government's main policy solution, delayed, as many Conservative MPs would say, is the idea of changing the law so you can bring in agency workers to replace striking staff. Would that work?
Well, that's their short-term solution, introduced via what's known as secondary legislation that they can do relatively quickly, and I think that will happen pretty soon, within the next couple of weeks, which is something of a stopgap and would only have, I think, a certain amount of value in terms of trying to ensure that more trains are running if strike action, like we saw yesterday, tomorrow and Saturday, continues. The second thing that they are keen to do, which is a manifesto commitment, is this idea of having a minimum service level baked in the event of industrial action. So it would only be able to drop to whatever percentage was chosen, and that would be the legal baseline even during industrial action, which will clearly be a weakening of trade union power, and there would be an argument about whether that was a legitimate thing to do, workers' rights versus the travelling public. You'd see that sort of debate mushroom again. Government would make the argument that it has a manifesto commitment to do it, and so the debate would start. But that's not going to happen in the short term. No. So certainly as far as the strikes that we already know are happening, they're going to carry on pretty much unless there's some sort of deal done, which there doesn't look like there's any prospect of in the short term. In the medium term, particularly with the prospect of further industrial action likely, given the economic picture and the conversation we've just been having, then maybe this kind of stuff does start to have a bearing, particularly in the context of transport.
Is it, I mean, when I say is it going to work in the short term, bringing in agency staff, we had Mick Lynch, the RMT General Secretary, here yesterday, and he said that the idea that an agency worker can rock up and safely and competently operate a complex signal control centre is a load of nonsense.
Well, I don't think agency workers would start operating signals, but there are probably some jobs in the railway that can be done by agency workers on the concourse and that kind of thing. I think this idea about minimum service levels, which wasn't...
But the trains won't run.
Well, I mean, obviously, we're talking about the drivers aren't on strike, for example, clearly. There are, as I said, there are some jobs on the railway that can be done by agency
staff. Yeah, but we're talking about what will get the trains back.
And it will help a bit. I mean, even yesterday with the strike, we had, I think, about a 20% service level. So if you can get that 20% up to 30% using some agency workers, it all helps a bit. The point about the manifesto commitment, minimum service levels, which I think countries like France have, is an interesting idea. I introduced a private member's bill when I was a backbencher.
But you've promised to do it for years. Why hasn't it happened?
Well, there's been COVID, you may have noticed, and Brexit, and it's in the manifesto, and it's now being taken away. It was in the manifesto in 2019.
2015, I think, and 17, and anyway.
But I had a private member's bill looking to do this, because I think it is unfair that the RMT union and others inflict misery on, children trying to take their exams, patients trying to get cancer treatment, people trying to get to work, in pursuit of their own narrow interests, when the average rail worker already gets paid £44,000. And Labour, of course, are clearly backing their trade union paymasters when they're not in deep hiding, which Keir Starmer seems to be not so much on the fence as hiding behind the fence.
Right, well, Thangan, what is the point of Keir Starmer saying to certainly the front bench, but Labour in general, don't go on the picket line, and there are 25 Labour MPs defying what he said and joining picket lines in this rail strike?
Labour MPs are busy being Labour MPs, challenging the government and actually pointing out the fact that
that's not the answer to my question. Why are they defying Keir Starmer's leadership?
I can't speak for those MPs.
What discipline should there be, if any?
It will be up to the Chief Whip and the leader of the party to decide, not me. And I think the person that needs to be ashamed here is the Secretary of State for Transport, who has not lifted a finger. There have been no meetings with the parties to the dispute. And as I've already said, but I want to remind everyone, the government is literally a party to the dispute. So why are they not?
Do you think it undermines Keir Starmer's ability to govern his own party if there are a sizable number of MPs, some of them frontbenchers, who are going onto the picket line?
148 Tory MPs recently voted to say they had no confidence whatsoever in the Prime Minister.
That is true.
I'm really
that
sure
is true.
That
but
carries
I'm
its
asking
own
about
tail, and I'm absolutely certain that our Chief Whip will be discussing with colleagues what needs to happen next in order to make sure. But really, we're mixing up different things here. Keir Starmer's leader of the Labour Party, he's not, sadly in my view, Prime Minister yet. Whereas this Prime Minister and his Secretary of State for Transport have not lifted a finger to sort out this dispute. And I think it's because it suits them to have a country that's arguing and heated debate, as Chris is demonstrating, and to blame people who are not to blame.
This dispute is not good
the
for
Secretary of State is not even bothering to try and
this
sort it out.
This dispute is no good for anyone, but Keir Starmer should be condemning it, which he's not.
All right, just briefly,
it's not good for anyone.
Because there's one more thing I want to discuss, but just briefly on this, the Chief Whip, the Chief Whip, I should say, for Labour is going to take some sort of decision. Have you heard what that might be?
Yeah, I was told that there won't be any decision taken about potential discipline of those frontbenchers, Labour MPs who turned up on picket lines until the end of the third day of strike action in this set, in other words, the end of Saturday. They weren't offering any indication as to what that discipline, whether it's a ticking off or ultimately the sack, might come their way.
Let me just show everybody this headline. BBC News, Number 10 doesn't deny Prime Minister had discussions over jobs for wife Carrie. It was actually the first question in this session of Prime Minister's questions, asking whether Boris Johnson had ever discussed a job for his spouse to the royal household in this particular issue. But tell us a bit more.
There's been three elements to this. Prime Minister ducked it entirely at PMQs. That disappearing times report over the weekend, I had two separate sources telling me that there had been a conversation that went on in the Foreign Office when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary about the idea of bringing in Carrie Simons, as she was then, as Chief of Staff. The advisers said it was a terrible idea and it didn't happen. In addition to that, there was the Mirror reporting yesterday of other conversations involving the COP Climate Summit and indeed working in the royal household, which Downing Street didn't deny yesterday and which the Prime Minister entirely ducked today. We should say these things are historic and didn't happen, but they raise questions again and again about the Prime Minister's character.
Unfortunately, it's time to end this conversation in the studio with my guest. Thank you to all of you for joining us here. I will, of course, be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:50. Bye-bye.